Okay, so tonight we're going to be looking primarily, a little bit of review on 17 and primarily at 18, and then 18 kind of finishes up and overlaps a little bit into 19, so we'll go through that. Then, next time we meet, we're going to talk about 19 and 20. Probably our friend from Ecuador, right? So we'll be looking at next time the rest 19 and 20, which is the. Hi there. It's the millennium and the great judgment of God. And then our last time together, at least for this study, will be the next time after that, which we'll look at chapters 21 and 22, the conclusion of Revelation. So we've got tonight and then 2 more times. It's my understanding that for the sake of peace and well-being, we're not meeting this week.
Yeah.
How's that? That's
This
good, isn't
next
it?
week we have
Yes, thank you.
2 different groups of people. One
It's okay.
boy that we took under our wing many years ago is coming in for his
Thank you.
30th class reunion.
All right.
I can't
Go ahead,
believe that.
put yours on
He
mute.
used to ride the Joy Bus when we did buses years ago. And so anyway, he and his family will be here, and then also because it's VBS, Sam and the little boys will be here for VBS. And I have another commitment that I have to go to on Sunday, so Roger would be here by himself with all that. And I think it would be better to just take a week off and then we'll hit it again.
Sorry, Roger.
So for the sake of shalom, we'll have
Yeah.
take a week break next week. So we'll have 2 more weeks together, 2 more times after tonight. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at chapter 18. And if you turn to 18, I think the best procedure for us is going to be to start by reading 18 together. And would anyone like to take a turn reading the first 5 verses of chapter 18?
After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons, and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes."
Okay, then would someone read beginning in verse 6 and read through verse 10?
Give back to her she is given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Mix her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts and sit as queen. I am not a widow, and I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her. Death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire. For mighty is she, the Lord God, who judges her. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and share her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, "Woe, O great city, O Babylon, city of power! In 1 hour your doom has come."
Okay, and then would someone read beginning in verse 11 and read through verse 19? Through verse 19.
The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and bodies and souls of men. They will say, the fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your riches and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. Is it through 15?
19.
The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, Woe, woe, O great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea, will stand far off. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, Was there ever a city like this great city? They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, Woe, woe, O great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin.
And then with someone read beginning in verse 20 and read to the end of the chapter.
Rejoice over her, O heaven. Rejoice, saints and apostles and prophets. God has judged her for the way she treated you. Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, With such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, flute players and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No workman of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's great men. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints, and of all who have been killed on the earth.
Okay, so this in part forms part of the climax of the book of Revelation that we were talking about before. 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22 all kind of form the sort of the climax of the book. And I want us to go back and reconsider a few minutes a little bit about who this woman, the Babylon the Great, the city of Babylon and Rome, sort of a composite picture, is all about. So to kind of do that, I want us to think about how, see if we can imagine a little bit about how people in the first century would have viewed her. So let's start by looking at one little reference. If someone would read chapter 14, verse 8, just that for the first place where this prostitute is mentioned.
A second angel followed and said, Fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of the adulteries.
Yep, that's it. Okay, so now in 17, this woman we looked at last time is portrayed as a prostitute, the great prostitute or great harlot, Babylon the Great, and there's some things about this as I was thinking about this. I meant to talk about, but I think I need to really spend some time talking about it with you tonight. And that is, and I'm not trying to. This may seem like an odd thing to do, to come to a Bible study and learn about prostitution. But we need to come to grips with what life in the first century was like in an urban environment, and how Christians would have perceived this image as they were hearing this described to them in the first century. So we know I told you last time that Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, the official language, the day-to-day language is actually Greek, but the official language of government and the language in Italy was Latin. And the Latin language is blessed or cursed in the way of having as a language the most different names for different types of prostitutes of any language that we know of. This causes some tension for us, because this woman in this prophecy, in this vision, is described as a common harlot. They use the word porne, which is the noun, one of the nominal derivatives from which we get the word pornography. And And yet she's also in many ways described as one of the other terms for a prostitute, a metrix, which was if there can be such a thing as a more respectable prostitute, I guess that would be it. That kind of prostitute is one who is a low person in society, but who lives the life to have one kind of paid lover at a time, and who would choose to use the common vernacular in America today, hook up with a wealthy person and be sort of their mistress, and have an illicit affair, and in return would be given money, would also give a lavish lifestyle, and so there's that kind of a prostitute. Oftentimes we refer to that person as in applied English as a courtesan. And then there is the other type of prostitute that's to this point, which is more of a base prostitute. And what I like, the way you can tell the difference, first of all, is by, and to use the Latin, kind of the way the Latin authors describe it, is they would look at the number of sexual partners a prostitute had to determine what kind of person and status they were in society. So one thing we could look at, there's like 4 or 5 places I can tell you them all off the top. There's 14:8, there's 17:2, there's 18:3 and 18:9, and chapter 19 verse 2, and all of them emphasize that this woman, this prostitute, has adulterated herself with large numbers of people, with large numbers of lovers, the kings of the earth, and at one point with the whole world, which would, in Roman vernacular, would make her really incredibly debased, and would be of the lowest class prostitute. And one of the things that we ought to understand is that prostitution, unlike in our culture, is sort of hidden away, unless you go to a place like New Orleans or Las Vegas. But it's usually kind of hidden away. In the culture of Rome, in the Roman world, and this would be true in the cities of Asia Minor, it was not hidden away. It was up front and center and in your face all the time. And we can look at some ancient authors who describe that. Just to give you an example of this, a guy who lived, a Latin author, a guy named Dio Chrysostom, who lived at the same time as John, wrote at the same time as this book is, this revelation is being recorded by John, and at the same time he wrote the gospel and so forth in his first 3 letters, was from originally Asia Minor, had this to say. He actually lived in most of his life in the province next door to Asia Minor, Bithynia. He laments about the profusion of prostitutes. He says, in dirty booths which are flaunted before the eyes in every part of the city, at the doors of the houses of magistrates, and in marketplaces, near government buildings, and in temples, in the midst of all that is holiest, that's where the prostitutes would carry on. In fact, they would, we know from other sources that they could be found from the range from circuses, theaters, amphitheaters, public buildings such as temples and baths, to markets, fairs, festivals, and public spectacles of every kind, to military encampments, even circuit courts. They were everywhere. In fact, one of the most popular spots was under the arches into entrance into the theater or into the arena. And you would have to encounter them. And by encountering them, we're not talking about people who are just kind of dressed like we think of a prostitute might dress, just sort of like the way a middle school student dresses today. But no, they would be open nudity. Oftentimes, well, frankly, nudity was looked upon a lot differently as far as the culture goes, the Roman culture, than in our culture. It's changing, of course, in our culture these days. But for instance, generally the way you could easily tell a slave, male or female, was that they often would be walking around in the city nude. That was just the way it was. And public nudity was not. It was seen as clothing was seen as a mark of status. For especially proper dress. For a man, public dress, they didn't wear this in normal day-to-day life, but when they were going out in public, men would wear a toga, and women would wear a special type of clothing for women. It's a little different and more comfortable than the toga. And then prostitutes were not allowed to wear normal women's dress. Normally they were allowed to wear a toga though. So if you saw a woman dressed in a toga, it meant that she was a prostitute. And they often wear other clothes, of course, or no clothes, but that was one way you could easily tell the difference. That might have something to do about one of the things that Paul in First Corinthians 11. We were just kind of referencing that at dinner even, but he talks about the importance of genders maintaining proper clothing. As my grandfather used to preach to me when I was in high school and in middle school, it talks about there how it's unseemly for a man to have long hair. So he would always point that out to me, that verse. It talks about women having a proper adornment and wearing proper clothing, and men wearing proper clothing for men. And so it's seen as inappropriate for a woman to wear a man's clothes and a man to wear a woman's clothes. But for a woman to wear a toga or a man's clothes in public was to declare herself a prostitute. Now, a lot of common places where prostitutes would also have their setups would be not only in public, in brothels, which were common. They're not really talked about the brothels that much in literature. There are a few places, but we know that they were common because we've excavated them and found them all over the place. But also, we find that if you went to a restaurant, there would be, the waitresses also doubled as prostitutes usually. And there would be prostitute booths in the restaurant. And the same thing, if you went to the theater, actors, both male and female, also doubled as prostitutes, and they would be right around the theater stage, the backstage, there would be prostitutes cells. And so everywhere you went, you would encounter this. Now, the reason why I point this out to you is because we know there's lots of evidence now, more and more, that the early church, they couldn't fit in most people's houses to meet. Only the wealthiest people would have a big enough house to have more than maybe 15 or 20 people in them. And so often they probably met in workplaces, or they met in restaurants, or tavernas, as they're called. And so you would have Christians holding a worship service, and just right off to the side would be, the prostitutes. So that just kind of gives some insight of the kind of context where people are living and having to deal with, and what they're having to deal with. So for John in this revelation to present to us what he saw as this great city, and remember we're portraying Rome, and Babylon as this composite figure, as such a vile kind of person, as a prostitute, is in that kind of situation, of that kind of behavior, which is lewdness in public. And of course the lowest form of prostitute would be a person who's standing, the woman would be forced to stand naked and offer her wares. Now, not that I know the earnest, but just to kind of show you how debased they would treat people and how horrible it was. We know that the going rate for the services of a prostitute was the equivalent of the price of bread, a loaf of bread, or about 1/6 a person's day's wages, which is not, when you think about it, very much. So it just shows you how they debase things even more. And we also ought to know, just to kind of let you know, that the activity of prostitution is associated with slaves in the bottomless society. In fact, many Roman authors will equate a prostitute with a slave. And when we excavated at Pompeii, and we uncovered prostitutes' names, and we found their names, we know that there were names. The Romans were really particular with this. People who were born free had a certain class of names, and you gave those kinds of people. People who were slaves were given another type of name. We had a different range of names to choose from, and so the names that we see as who are prostitutes are all the names of people who were at least slaves or were former slaves. And this prostitute is the other thing we know from the late first century. There's several authors that talk about this, and that is that the most lowest form of slave was treated with the utmost contempt and degraded by their owner by having tattoos placed, especially on their forehead. In Roman society, a tattoo was the most degrading thing you could do to your body, almost. And so when this woman has on her forehead the name, Babylon the Great, and she's in prostitutes, whatever, it talks about in chapter 17, we have a description of a woman who's extremely lowest form of a slave, a person who's degraded in that fashion. We know that the fact that she's wearing scarlet and purple and lots of jewelry is not a sign of anything unusual, because there's a couple of places. There's a great Roman dramatist, guy named Plautus. I don't know if anyone here ever heard of Plautus. Didn't think so, but it was extremely popular. If you like Shakespeare's comedies, you ought to know that Shakespeare regularly ripped off Plautus for his characters and his themes, and for his plots. He's changed the plots a little bit. And so Shakespeare studied Plautus, and he's one considered one of the early fathers of comedy and the farce. But he has characters, and he likes to have characters sometimes who are prostitutes, and he has these prostitutes dressed up in the same way that this prostitute is dressed up in Revelation, with the scarlet and the purple, with fancy clothes and all the gold jewelry hanging down almost in a very ostentatious way. A person like that standing in the theater, outside the theater, waiting, trying applying their wares. We also have another ancient source of a comedy, or actually a famous story called The Ephesian Tale of Xenophon of Ephesus, which is another sort of popular Roman novel. And in it, there's a character named Anthea who's sold into slavery and is compelled to exhibit herself in front of the brothel, decked out in the same kind of clothes, scarlet and purple, with lots of jewelry. So again, the lavish dress of this woman fits into that description. However, there are some things that don't fit. The fact that this woman is enthroned. You remember she talks about how she's been enthroned. Over and over again, it talks about she's sitting on top of the beast. She's been made a queen. She's not gonna be. She says she's a queen. She's not going to be a widow. She's enthroned. That all doesn't fit in at all. And so it might fit in with her being a type of prostitute known as a metrix, who would attend a Roman or a Greek symposium dinner party for men. But she doesn't fit totally in that the formal one of the aristocrats, because she's drunk. However, she might fit into a typical Roman kind of lower class party kind of situation. By the way, if you think about this, prostitutes were they were marketed to the poor, because if you were a rich person, you didn't have to consort with a prostitute. You just could buy your own slave for sexual purposes, which is often what happened, unfortunately. And so a prostitute is someone who's servicing, who's marketing themselves to the poor of society, which makes them even lower form of person, at least in the socially conscious world of the Romans. So what do we deal with this issue of this woman who's enthroned, who is this prostitute, and how would people think about that in the first century? And one way we can think about this is thinking about some of the ways that classical authors talk about certain prostitutes or in an imperial setting. And it was a common technique of the Roman author, actually Roman historians, Suetonius and Tacitus, two famous Roman historians, to write down and preserve for perpetuity the sort of these accusations or slanderous statements about the emperor and his family, and is a way, often in a very salacious and sexually oriented kind of slanderous statements, is a way to try to discredit them. so we read about Suetonius' account, for instance, of the Emperor Caligula. Does anyone know who Caligula is? Anyone ever heard of Caligula? He's considered one of the worst emperors of the Roman Empire, probably because of Suetonius. Anyway, Caligula, his name was actually Gaius. He had been grown up in a Roman military family, and around the emperor, and the soldiers gave him a nickname which means little boot or little shoe, and that's what Latin Caligula is. And he came to power, and everyone thought he was going to be after he was in the court, and he was a stepson of the Emperor Tiberius, who was the emperor during the time of Jesus. And Tiberius was a wicked emperor. He suspected that everyone was against him. He retired to the island of Capri, and he would have senatorial families show up, and he would interrogate them and torture them to death. He would kill people by cutting off one limb and piece of them at a time, and he'd make this family watch, and also his court watch. And so this is the kind of thing that Caligula grew up watching. And you never knew when it might be your turn. And he was also very sexually perverse. Caligula had slaves, both male and female, for sexual purposes, and castrated male slaves in order to have homosexual relations with them. And it was just a wicked guy. So he grew up in that kind of setting. Everyone hated Tiberius, thought that Caligula was going to be okay. He thought it was going to be better than that, but it turned out that he was actually kind of worse. And it got so bad that he was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, and they looked for someone who they thought would be a good, who they could control. The Praetorian Guard did. They looked for someone who was kind of stupid. They thought that he was, sort of a special education person, and they found this guy named Claudius. Okay. And they made him emperor, the Praetorian Guard did. And Claudius had a wife. His third wife at the time was a woman by the name of Messalina. Has anyone ever heard of, years ago there was there's this series on TV called I, Claudius. Did anyone ever see that? No? Okay. Too long ago. Okay, so Messalina is an interesting character in Roman history. She was the mother of people who were actually potential emperors in the future, and Suetonius and Tacitus didn't like that. They didn't like that family line too much, so they sought to discredit her in a big way. She died in 40 AD during the reign of her husband Claudius, and she is presented as, use the Latin phrase, the Augusta Metrix, or the imperial whore. She is seen to show off her husband as being really stupid and idiotic. She regularly had affairs with several senators, the Roman senators, and while she was married to the emperor, and would flaunt them. And at one point, I guess one of the Praetorian Guard had enough and stabbed her to death. And when there was a dinner party going on, the Claudius entertaining, and he was told about his wife's death, and he just continued. He just took up another beer and had a drink, and kept on going, and it was no big deal. But she is portrayed by Tacitus and Suetonius and Juvenal as this emperor harlot, and it's said that she had this imperial harlot figure. And it's an incredible judgment and description of what Rome stands for and what Babylon before it stood for. Okay, so I'm not gonna get a long time to talk about that. It's gonna get me to the next point that we need to look at. Look with me at chapter 18, please. And if you would just kind of skim over for a minute, verses 1 through 5. And besides the adulteries of this woman, this Babylon the Great, what is she condemned for?
Home of demons and every evil spirit.
Okay, so she's spiritually she's bankrupt. Okay. She has sold herself to the kings of the earth and to the world.
She's a home for every unclean bird.
Yes, she's unclean. Yes. What else? What else is it she's obsessed with besides sex and unclean things and defiling things? What else is she obsessed with?
Power, luxury of living.
Luxury, luxurious living, and wealth. Okay? And so, what happens then is we have, after this, a description of the collapse of all of this luxurious living and wealth, as well as her having prostituted herself. There's one other thing that she's guilty of that we talked about before, and that is that she has made everything unclean that she comes in contact with. She makes unholy, both people and places. We talked about that with what's in her cup. But also she drinks the blood of the saints, so she's obsessed with killing and persecuting those who belong to God, who stand for everything. Okay, so she's against them. So it kind of, we looked at that last time in chapter 17. So to kind of give a composite for her, she's a persecutor of the Christians. She defiles people and places that she comes in contact with. She's obsessed with selling herself to the kings of the earth and to the rest of the world, and prostituting herself in that way. And she is obsessed with wealth and obsessed with luxurious living and luxuries. Everyone got that? That's really important. Okay, so the first group of people that mourn for her are the kings of the earth. Is that not right? If you look with me, the Christians are told to come out of the Babylon the Great so they don't experience a judgment. That's in verses 4 and 5. And then the angel describes asks God to give her back double of what she's done. Make her drink a double portion of her own cup that defiles her. Give her, in verse 7, as much torture and grief as she did, and glory and luxury as she gave herself. So these four things are contrasted: torture and grief versus glory and luxury. So the angel asks God to double her glory with grief and double her luxuries with torture. Does everyone understand that comparison? Okay. If you look with me at verse 9, at verse 9, in 10, it says, when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn of her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, woe, woe, O great city of Babylon, city of power, in 1 hour your doom has come. What upsets the kings of the earth? Her torment. Why do you think it would upset them?
It was the means of being survived.
Except you
They may
you-
feel they're next.
Okay.
Compare luxury with torment, right?
Yes.
So the luxury would be gone. So the trade, commerce, whatever, with Rome would be gone, and that hurts their wallet.
Okay. That's certainly true for the merchants. If you're a king and you have adulterated yourself with this woman, in other words, you bought into her, you bought into her lifestyle, her worldview, you're part of that, and she's being destroyed, and you're really frightened by and upset by the amount of torture that she endures, her torment, you might feel you're next. What else might be going through your mind?
Wouldn't there be some kind of, I know it's done in the open, but wouldn't it be, they're gonna know, I don't find out what I get.
Okay, sure. There certainly might be an exposure of you. Okay. Anything else? Have any of you ever lived without TV for a week? Okay. How about how about the normal stuff like electricity and you take advantage of, or running water, whatever it's called. What's that like?
Oh, man.
Well,
It's a luxury.
It's a luxury.
yes, but what is it like to lose it?
Not
What did you-
not a good thing, it's torture. man.
Torture.
It's torture.
Why is it torture?
Because we've had it before, and we're not gonna have it anymore, like, oh man. Lose it. What? I don't wanna lose it.
Okay.
She was my source of income. Doggone it.
Okay. When we experience potential loss or we lose things that we're used to, that we depend upon, that we become to assume that they're ours, that have and we should have it, and we lose those things. It's a very disorienting experience and very troubling experience, and very stressful. When I was in high school, my youth leader took us to a place on an adventure camp to a place called Adventurous Christians up in the boundary waters of Minnesota, Canada, in extreme northern Minnesota, southern Canada. And we would go canoeing in that area for like 10 days. And you get dropped off in the middle of nowhere, and you have to be at another point 120 miles away by such and such time on such and such a date. And there's no electricity, there's no bathroom, there's no running water. There's running water, but it's in the lakes and the rapids, but there's no conveniences. The food is freeze dried and lousy. There's bears, and the bears might get your food. You can take you can start stripping away all the things that you used to as a teenager, and they're all taken away, and it's an incredibly stressful experience, and humbling experience, and shocking experience, and forces you to face the reality of who you are, and as a person, in what life is really all about. And so, if you can think about this, if this great harlot who they've identified with and have joined themselves with is stripped of everything, it's a very shocking thing to see that happen, and it's also frightening and stressful for you to observe it or experience that in your own way, even from a distance, because it really shows you the fragility of all that stuff that you depend upon, and that it's not really who you are. Sort of like as a substitute teacher, having to confiscate a middle school student's cell phone. It's an interesting experience to see how they panic. They almost have a mental breakdown in front of you, because they're so dependent upon that. So much of their life is consumed by it. So that's one thing I would like to point out. Okay, so now we look at the next section. We have the merchants. Roman historians love this because it's one of the best, earliest sources of information about Roman culture and the economy of the Roman world. But let's look at the kinds of things that the merchants were involved in selling to Rome, to this Babylon the Great. So the merchants of the earth, they weep and mourn. Why do they weep and mourn, by the way?
This town's gonna buy their cargoes anymore. Their cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls.
Yes. They've lost their customer base.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sam's Club is officially closed, along with Walmart.
We ought to know a little bit of some of these items. I'm just going to highlight a few things that might give you a feel for also the extent of the Roman economy. So gold and silver in the first century was that's how the Roman Empire was sustaining itself. Before the first century, up until Augustus, when he ended the wars of conquest, the Roman Empire existed by plunder. Basically, they conquered territory and they plundered of its wealth. But after the Peace of Rome happened, the Pax Augusta, they had to shift a new source of income. Luckily for them, they had conquered Spain, and what they found in Spain were very large deposits of gold and silver. And so they developed extremely sophisticated means of mining the gold and silver and extracting it. In fact, a lot of the methods we use today are derived from that. We even know the extent of this because in smelting the gold out of the ore, they had to use chemical processes that created pollution. And you can go to the glaciers on Iceland and do core samples that go back to the first century and beyond, and you'll see in the first century there's a huge spike in the level of air pollution of those kinds of pollutants right when these mines are going full tilt, and they're extracting massive amounts of gold and silver ore from Spain. So we know that they did that. They extracted lots. They brought that in. They brought precious stones. Mainly those came from the deserts of North Africa and Egypt, and they were imported from there. They built whole cities out in the middle of the desert and had to ship water in to supply those cities because there's no water nearby, so they could mine those precious stones. Fine linen. The best linen later on, by this time we were speaking, comes from, anyone know?
Made flax, isn't it?
Yes, it is made from flax, but you know where it comes? The best linen in the ancient world comes from the Galilee. It comes from Israel. Right after the time of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem, right around that time, Galilee became heavily settled, and they needed to come up with a new cash crop to support the increased income. They found that they could grow flax there and process it very well, and made it into the finest flax in the ancient world. And so it came from Israel, as did 98% of the glass. The raw glass came from Israel, northern Israel as well. We talked a little about purple. There are a couple ways of making purple, but there was regular purple, which is made out of different plants. But the best purple was made from the mollusk from a mollusk that was found in the eastern Mediterranean, along the shore of what is today Lebanon and northern Israel. And there are mounds of the shells where they process that. About every mollusk would produce about a drop of dye. It would take thousands and thousands of mollusks to dye something this purple. It was really prized because not only was it just a purple color, but it had sort of a silvery kind of tinge to it, so it was sort of shiny and reflective as well. Sort of a shiny purple, we might say, or a silvery purple. And so that stuff went for extremely high price. Only usually the wealthiest people and kings and queens could afford it. Silk. They raised silk in Israel, but they also raised it mainly in India. And most people realize this, but the Romans maintained a shipping office in different ports in India, and were shipping goods back then by sea from India to Rome. And that a lot of that still came from India. It also came from China even. It was also extremely expensive. Most people, the average person's clothing was made out of wool. If you were wealthy, you could have something made out of linen. If you were super rich, you could have something made out of silk. Scarlet cloth. I talked about where the scarlet dye comes from.
Lice.
That's right. The nits are the eggs of lice. It takes a lot of lice to make enough dye for that. But that was the most prominent, richest red came from that. There were cheaper reds like from madder, the madder plant. You can get some red, but it's not anywhere near the quality of that. And there's also you can get a red from a beetle that grows on an oak tree called the Kermes oak. It's a Kermes beetle, which also you could get some red dye, but it's not nowhere near the most prized red, which was this deep scarlet red that comes from the nits of lice. Then there is citron wood or lemon wood or wood that is made of citrus plant wood. That also would come from the Orient. It was the most prized and expensive wood of the ancient world. And ivory. Ivory we know comes from elephants. It came from Africa. Tuss, exactly right. That's where that came from. And that was shipped in from Africa or lower Africa or also in Asia. And bronze. Bronze is expensive because it's made from tin and copper. Copper would be common in the Roman Empire. You can find lots of copper mines. But tin is in short supply. It would come from Great Britain or Ireland or up in extreme, what is now today known as Armenia. Marble, the type of marble they like different types of colored marbles, especially those come from the deserts of Egypt and of the Sahara Desert. It was really expensive and costly because there's no water where the marble deposits are found. They build cities, have to get water there, but also they'd have to ship that. They have to carry the marble slabs across the desert to get them to ships before they could ship them to Rome. So you can see, kind of think of the expense. There's this one particular prized marble, sort of a grayish color, that was found in the extreme desert of Egypt that was so far away from any way to ship it that they would make it into columns and they would be shipped across and it was so expensive that only people could afford it were the emperor. If you go to the church of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey, which was actually originally the Christian church by that name, it wasn't made into a mosque, but it was the church of Justinian when he made, and it was the biggest church in Christendom at one point. And you can see two columns that survive made of that marble. It's very, very rare to find them, and very rare because they're so expensive. So that was that. Cinnamon and the spices that are mentioned come from. Anyone know? This one, pardon?
From East Asia?
Yes, they come from East Asia, the Indonesia area. And so that had been shipped all the way from there to India, and then from India to Rome, at a very, very high price. Myrrh and frankincense. We read about these at Christmas. I should have brought some with me. I have some at home. Myrrh and frankincense come from two different bushes. There's the sap from those bushes. They grow in what is today Yemen. That's the only place they really grow. Very valuable and expensive in the ancient world. As well as wine and olive oil. Okay, so 3 good places for growing wine. Italy, of course. Asia Minor, great place for growing wine. And Judah of Israel. The 3 most prized wines in the ancient world came from those 3 places. Not France, but Italy, Asia Minor, and Israel, Judah, Israel. Olive oil. Best olive oil comes from
Greece.
today Greece. Yes, they would have olive oil there, but that was common olive oil. That was not the best oil. The best oil came from Lebanon and Israel. The Galilee was a big exporter of olive oil in the ancient world, as well as also to the north in Lebanon and into Syria. That was a primary olive oil region. Wheat. Best wheat in the world at that time comes from Egypt. Cattle will come from a lot of different places. France, they raise a lot of cattle, and also they would raise cattle in Spain. And they would raise some in Italy, and of course they at one time before this they raised it in Israel. The Philistines were what we call a cattle culture. They were a cattle culture, and they hence worshipped a bull. But they raised lots of cattle. They ate lots of beef, and the Philistines, they were beef eaters. Then we have sheep, horses, carriages, and of course slaves. The slave market on the island of Delos in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, sold 30,000 slaves a day on average. And they kept meticulous records in the first century. So 30,000 people a day were sold into slavery. The source of slaves, most people think there were a couple different sources. One source of slavery slaves were conquest, but when the conquest ended, not many slaves come from there anymore. So slaves would give birth to more slaves. Other people thrown into debt, be sold into slavery. So many they would be debtors that lost their freedom. And also there was another source of slavery, and one which maybe speaks to our culture in a way, and that is this. The Roman Empire, abortion was a fact of life. However, it was common if you didn't have the money, only the rich could afford the medicines used to cause an abortion. So what they often would do was they would carry a baby to term and expose it on a hillside and let it die. And there's actually a famous site of that outside the city of Ephesus, which later became a center for the Christian church. And they would, people would gather up the slaves. They would go looking for slaves. They would gather up these little infant children that had been left to die in exposure, and they would raise them as slaves, and then they would sell them to slave markets. Usually they would rescue boys and leave the girls to die. However, sometimes they would leave. They would take the girls, and they would most often be raised as slaves and made into prostitutes. That one of the early Christian witnesses of the church in Ephesus, we know in the 2nd century, was that they would collect those exposed babies and start in orphanages and raise them to be free, normal people and not slaves. Give them an education, give them a start in life. Which made the Christian church stand out as different from the people around them. When I was studying archaeology in Israel, the clearest way you could tell, my archaeologist professor would point out to us, the clearest way you can tell when you're excavating a home, whether it's a Christian home or a Jewish home or a Gentile home, is that when you got into the level of the basement or underneath the floor or the pavement, in a Christian home, it would just be dirt or previous levels of occupation. In a pagan home, a non-Jewish home, non-Christian home, you would encounter the skeletons of fetuses because abortion was so common. And what you would do was you would just open up the stone in the floor and bury the fetus. That's how you usually exposed of it. And that's the way you can kind of tell that kind of a site, identify them even today. It was so a distinctive thing to be able to tell the difference between a Christian or a Jew and a pagan, because Christians and Jews didn't believe in the value of life. So they sold people's souls, and they have lost all these markets, and as a result, they weep and mourn. Do you think they're weeping and mourning for Babylon, or do you think they're weeping and mourning for themselves?
So hard to believe.
Okay. And then finally, the third group that mourns are the sea captains and the people on ships. These would be the truckers of the ancient world. And they mourn as well because they are losing cargoes. They throw dust over their heads. And we ought to talk a little bit about how shipping went in the ancient world a little bit, first century stuff. The average, I'm doing too many ums. Yeah.
It's kind of
Let's say I'm a merchant, and let's say I'm a farmer, and I want to take something to market. And we can pretend that we're fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, and it's summertime, and we have been fishing at night, and we have gathered we've caught a whole bunch of freshwater sardines, which were a common crop in the first century in Jesus' day, the first century on the Sea of Galilee. And so we take those fish to a city called Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from, and there is a processing plant there. They might do two things with the fish. They would maybe cut off the heads and make a fish sauce. With that, they would ferment the fish heads, and that would be sold as a Spain spice and a core ingredient of Roman cooking. And then the other parts of the sardines, we would pickle them. We'd put them in salt, maybe some vinegar or some vinegar wine, or maybe some olive oil, different recipes for that. And we put them in clay amphora jars, and then we would seal them up with wax and a cork, so to speak, and with wax over it. And then we would take those, and there'd be a donkey caravan. Every week would be coming through town, and they would. So we would hire that caravan for a fee. They would either buy outright our amphora of this fish, or they would take a cut, and they would put on their donkeys. They would be probably around the Tuesday of the week, and they would take them to the city of Tyre or Sidon, and they would sell them to a merchant who would buy the whole off the donkey carriers, the crop, let's say our amphora of fish. And then the merchant would contract with a shipper, a boat captain, to take his shipment of fish to Rome, let's say. So what he would do was a couple things. He'd need to buy insurance. So he'd go to an insurance broker in Tyre, and the deal would be that the insurance broker would agree to insure the shipment from loss for a commission of 50% of the value of the shipment. Okay? So in order to make sure that my shipment of fish, which is probably maybe, let's say it's a lot of fish, let's say it's probably 10,000 amphora, something like that, a significant amount of fish, they are not going to be stolen, because I have this premium, but I still want to be able to get my money when I get, because they don't have a banking system that's sophisticated. I'm going to book passage on the ship as well, so I'm going to have the fish put on the ship, and I'm going to go with the shipment, and we get on the boat, and we're going to go across the Mediterranean, and let's say there's no storms, we get an easy trip across, and we make it to the port of Ostia. They're going to take off the ship is going to take a profit probably of about a quarter we go to the port of Ostia, and at that time, and we unload it, and they're put in warehouses, and right away there's an auction at the warehouse, and we sell to other merchants those amphora of fish from the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so the shipper gets a third, the insurance broker gets a half, or a quarter, and the person who is the merchant gets a quarter. So you can see how the cuts work. It's not that you need to ship a large quantity to make much money, and how things work in the ancient world in the first century. So as a result of that, these merchant ships, when you're shipping all these goods, if I am going to get a quarter of a shipment of citron wood or a quarter of a shipment of silk, and it gets to the warehouse in Ostia and they sell it, or Puteoli later on, I'm going to make a significant amount of money. And the shipping business is a lucrative business because one, while my ship is at risk from pirates or storms, if I'm careful and I make these trips, I can 3 or 4 trips and I've paid for my ship, another 3 or 4, and I'm living the life of luxury, especially if I'm taking stuff from India or the Persian Gulf across. And you can see how these merchants they're also very upset because now their shipping market has been lost as well. Okay, so we've seen the kings of the earth, we've seen the merchants of the earth, we've seen the shippers of the world, and we've seen the people who are bought into this whole luxurious lifestyle. They're all very upset. How does heaven react to the demise of?
Rejoice.
They rejoice. How do they rejoice? How am I doing on time? Overtime?
You're starting to go over yet.
7:05.
Okay, I'll try to finish in the next 5 minutes. How do they react?
They rejoice.
They rejoice. Specifically, how do they rejoice?
Picking up a rock and throwing it in the sea. No, I don't know.
And we can say, they just say they rejoice.
They
Since
rejoice.
Also, that prophets, God has judged her for the way she was treated you.
Let's look at chapter 19 as a conclusion to see exactly how they rejoice. And I'm just going to go ahead and read it. It says, "After this, I heard what sounded like the roar of a great multitude in heaven, shouting, 'Hallelujah! Salvation and glory and power belong to our God, for true and just are his judgments. He has condemned the great prostitute who corrupted the earth by her adulteries. He has avenged on her the blood of his servants.' And again they shouted, 'Hallelujah! The smoke from her goes up forever and ever.' The 24 elders and the 4 living creatures fell down and worshipped God who was seated on the throne, and they cried, 'Amen, Hallelujah.' Then a voice came from the throne saying, 'Praise our God, all you his servants, you who fear him, both small and great.' Then I heard what sounded like a great multitude, like the roar of rushing waters, and like loud peals of thunder, shouting, 'Hallelujah! For our Lord God Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and this bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the saints.' And the angel said to me, 'Write, blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb.' And he added, 'These are the true words of God.' At this I fell at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, 'Do not do it. I am a fellow servant with you and with your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy.'" And so what happens is, heaven rejoices and declares God's salvation and his power and his reign at the destruction of Babylon the Great, who is consumed with materialism and being obsessed with obtaining luxuries and material wealth and living the life of luxury and of power and prestige and glory that comes from that, and of all that she stands for. So you see, heaven rejoices when the world of luxuries and obsession with luxuries is destroyed, which should leave you with a great deal of pause, living in America in the 21st century, in a culture that's obsessed with luxury. I often ponder the meaning of this because of that and what it stands for, having rejoicing in such a loss. And it's a radical thing for me. But I can't help but remember these couple of facts. That the average salary, annual salary in the world today, anyone know what it is? The average salary in the world today,
It's pretty low.
$714 a year. That's the average. That there are, at this point, 2 billion people in the world who live on less than $2 a day per person. And that there is 1 billion people in the world today who live on less than $1 a day on average. When you think of what world we live in here in the United States and in this in the community we live in, and the amount of what we have, reading this can't help but give you pause if you take it to heart. That what God values is very different from what the culture we live in values. I'm not being anti-capitalist here. I think they don't take me down. I'm not trying to say that at all. What I'm trying to say is what God values is very different from what we tend to value in this culture. We tend to value power and prestige and luxury and wealth. We like to have nice things. Most people want to have, that's normal. That's and that's bad. But God does not value those things. He so much does not value them that when He destroys them, there is rejoicing in heaven. And I'm left to pause at that as I live in luxury. And this is the part of Revelation that as Americans we often gloss over. But it's a message to those Christians in the first century who are facing persecution and hardship because they were willing to take a stand for Jesus, even though right now they're living in the midst of great prosperity in Asia Minor, but they are going to be left out because if they stay faithful to Jesus and take a stand. They will often lose their jobs. They will often lose even their homes. They will be persecuted. They may lose their lives. They will suffer for the name of Jesus. And in the midst of living in that kind of luxury, of which Asia Minor was at that time, one of the most prosperous provinces in the whole Roman Empire in the first century, it's a difficult message for them to have to hear. That following Jesus is much more important than our luxurious lifestyle. And that standing firm for Him may, or may not, but may cause that to be sacrificed. It's not that He totally condemns the Christians who live in that culture, because He talks about how there are Christians who live in amidst the great Babylon, and there's a point when they're called to come out of it, to leave it, because it's going to be destroyed. There's a place for us as Christians in this culture to speak to it, but we ought to understand its temporal nature, and that it is not what this culture values is not necessarily what God values. And if we're to be followers of Christ, we're to seek what God values in our lives. That brings us to the end of chapter 18.